Let us continue our discussion on Chapter 3, Class 12th NCERT NEET Biology. The name of the chapter is Human Reproduction, and we have reached section 3.4, which is about the menstrual cycle. It's an important concept from this chapter. Very frequently a question is framed from this section of your NCERT textbook. And as we both are aware that this question is most likely directly from the NCERT, so we will try to understand the concepts and the facts that are given in NCERT and wherever needed, in order to understand exactly the concepts and facts of NCERT, we will definitely try to elaborate the topic as well. Now, keeping this thing in mind, let me directly refer to your NCERT textbook. So this is the section of your NCERT, and this is about menstrual cycle, and it says that the reproductive cycle, mind the word, the reproductive cycle in the female primates is called menstrual cycle. So we know what is a menstrual cycle. It is a reproductive cycle in the female primates. Now, primates are mammals. We are talking of only female primates. Now, these primates include monkeys, apes, and human beings. So that means the menstrual cycle does not occur in the non-primate female mammals. They may have estrous cycle, and the estrous cycle is actually characterized by the lack of the menstrual flow, rather than the endometrium part of the uterus that is shed in the menstrual cycle is reabsorbed in the cases of the estrous cycle. That would be a fundamental difference between the two. So now we understand it is the reproductive cycle in the female primates that is called as the menstrual cycle. So taking a cue from this thing, let us discuss the basics of the menstrual cycle. So the first point to consider would be that, do you remember the cause of the onset of puberty in the human females? I told you that it is because of the secretion of, or beginning of the secretion of, gonadotropin releasing hormone by the hypothalamus. So onset of puberty is a complex phenomena. So many events are associated with the onset of puberty that may include the development of the breast tissue, which is normally called as thelarche, and the development of the pubic hair, which is called as pubarche. But one of the important events that you must remember is menarche. So this menarche is the beginning of the menstrual flow. So the first occurrence of the menstrual flow or menstrual period, as it is frequently called, would be called as menarche. And this menstrual flow, which is actually shedding of the uterine endometrium, it would be an event that may actually happen over 2 to 5 days. And then what is going to happen is that during the reproductive period of the female life, this thing will occur periodically. And that means after a few days time, again there would be a period of menstrual flow, and so on and so forth. This thing is repeated again and again, and at a regular interval. You may not be able to appreciate the regular interval. I must be absolutely clear that this should be fairly uniform interval normally. Now, the first day of the menstrual flow is called as the first day of the menstrual cycle, and the first day of the next menstrual flow would be called as the beginning or the first day of the next menstrual cycle, which means that this tells me that all the events that are occurring from the beginning of the menstrual flow to the beginning of the next menstrual flow, so day 1 of this menstrual flow to day 1 of the subsequent menstrual flow, all these events that are occurring between these two menstrual flows would be called as the menstrual cycle or the reproductive cycle. I hope this is absolutely clear. What exactly is menstrual cycle? Now, this menstrual cycle actually serves two purposes. So just giving you another concept, this menstrual cycle, it is ideally of 28 days duration. So this would be an ideal. So when you say that what is a normal heart rate of a human being, you don't say that it is 72 or 75 per minute. There will always be a range. So if I am not having at present a heart rate of 72 or 75, then if it is not normal, then it has to be abnormal. That will be a very narrow way of looking at things. There is always a range. Anything between 60 to 100 can be normal actually. So we are saying that 28 days would be an ideal menstrual cycle. It can vary from 25, even 24 to 35 days, and provided a female is having, say for example, a female is having 30 days cycle, and every time she has 29, 30, 31 days cycle, we will call it as a normal. And abnormality would be a cycle of 24 days, then the next of 40 days. You can understand what I am trying to convey. So there is a thing which is called as ideal, and there is something which is called as normal. So this is the day one of the menstrual flow. This is the day one of the menstrual cycle. Roughly we will be considering the events related to an ideal menstrual cycle, which would be of 28 days. And roughly in the middle of this cycle, probably most commonly on day 14, there would be an event which would be called as the ovulation. And you can immediately understand that there would be some sequence of events that would be pre-ovulatory, and there would be some sequence of events that would be post-ovulatory. I hope this is very, very clear. Now I am just giving you the very basics of the menstrual cycle. So we are saying that a typical menstrual cycle roughly in the middle is characterized by the process of release of the secondary oocyte. If you remember from the previous video, that event would be called as ovulation, and just before it are the events that are pre-ovulatory, and later on they are post-ovulatory. Now the purpose of the female sexual cycle or the reproductive cycle or the menstrual cycle is actually two. So one is, if you remember the primary follicle which had primary oocyte present in it was arrested at metaphase 1 of arrested at diplotin of prophase 1 of meiosis 1, and its development will begin. The first of the functions of the menstrual cycle would be to develop follicle so that it matures and ruptures and releases a secondary oocyte, which is called as ovulation. So that means this part of the cycle will be responsible for the development of the follicle into a mature follicle. That mature follicle ruptures and releases a single ovum, usually per cycle, and that will happen in the middle of the cycle. And then the second half actually has a very important function to perform. That would be that in the event of the fertilization of the released secondary oocyte or the ovum, the uterus must be prepared for the implantation for the pregnancy functions. So that means this part of the cycle would be responsible for making the uterus ready for implantation. I hope now you understand the importance of the two halves of the cycle and the specific function they perform. Now one more thing, when I talk to students, they usually feel very confused in this topic. Just have a simple logical thinking here. We are saying that the ovary is the site of synthesis of the gonadal steroids in the female. So we are looking at ovary, and ovary synthesizes the steroidal hormones. The two steroidal hormones would be estrogen. The main estrogen would be estradiol, and the other one would be progesterone. So these are the ovarian steroids. But we must not forget the gonadotropins, and these gonadotropins are actually secreted by the anterior pituitary hormones. So the anterior pituitary hormone releases gonadotropins, and we know that gonadotropins are FSH and LH. So now we are looking at four important hormones, two gonadotropins and two gonadal steroids. Now the basic thing to understand is that because they are gonadotropins, they will be be acting on the gonads, and the gonad in this case is the ovary. Inside the ovary, in the cortex, you remember there were present the follicles. So that means we expect that the development of the follicles will primarily be because of the gonadotropins, because it is called as gonadotropin. Its effect will be on gonads. FSH and LH will not have any direct effect directly on uterus, cervix, etc. They will not have any effect on the fallopian tube. They are gonadotropins. So this is a very useful concept to understand. So we are saying that these gonadotropins, they will be present predominantly, they will be present here. That means in the pre-ovulatory part. And because we know that progesterone is sometimes also called as the pregnancy hormone, so this post-ovulatory part must be regulated, or must be under the control mainly of the progesterone. So this is what we are doing with respect to the function that each half of the cycle has to perform. And now we are able to understand that where would a particular hormone be predominantly secreted. Estrogen, you must be aware of this, that it is actually secreted throughout the menstrual cycle. So this is what we know. So we are saying, again, just to sum it up, we are saying that I would see a predominance of the gonadotropins. Here I would see a predominance of progesterone, and obviously estrogen will play a very, very important role. I have already told you that in the female reproductive physiology, the secretion of the hormones are never during any part of the menstrual cycle at a constant level. So it is not like the simple hormonal regulation of the male reproductive system. There is a complex interplay between gonadotropins and gonadal steroids, and there are cyclical variations. There are cyclical variations in the secretions of the gonadotropins and the gonadal steroids, both influencing each other. So this would be a complex thing that we will try to understand what happens. And it is again very important to understand that there are some changes which will be occurring in the ovary, and simultaneously there must be some changes that must be occurring in the uterus, because ovary is where the gamete is going to be produced. Fallopian tube is where this gamete will be fertilized, but the embryo will be implanted on the uterus, and the gestation would be provided by the uterus. So there must be some changes, some occurring in ovary and some occurring in the uterus. We know ovarian changes predominantly by the gonadotropins, and we know that the changes that will be brought about in the uterus would be primarily because of the gonadal steroids. I hope this thing is now absolutely clear. It's a very, very useful concept to have. Now what happens is this is very, very important to understand that. And incidentally, let me just give you one more question. So when we say that there is an event in the middle of the menstrual cycle which is called as ovulation, the ovulation occurs 14 days prior to the onset of the next cycle. So you do not count 14 days from day 1. From the onset of the next cycle, you count backwards, and then it would be the day 14. So now please understand this. If it is a 28-day cycle, this has to be day 14. You count either way. But if it is a 29-day cycle, actually the ovulation is most likely to occur on day 15, because for this menstrual cycle, this is the day 1, and ovulation occurs 14 days prior to the onset of the next cycle. So we will be calling it as day 15. I hope this thing is absolutely clear. Now, as I told you, the beginning of the menstrual cycle, now we are talking with respect to the uterine changes. This would be the menstrual flow. This would be the menstrual flow, and we say that this would be anything between 2 to 5 days. So anything between 2 to 5 days. Now what is happening is that in this period, the uterine endometrium is shed. So the endometrium is shed. So this is what is called as the menstrual flow. It leads to a loss of some blood, and that is the menstrual blood, and the endometrium is shed, and this can take over a period of 2 to 5 days. Now the first thing would be that after this thing happens, this endometrium must be regenerated. Now just try to make sense of this. So that means there must be a mechanism to regenerate the endometrium, and this regeneration of the endometrium would be by the process which is called as proliferation. It will be because of proliferation. And when we are talking of the changes in the endometrium, then in this period the endometrium will be regenerated by proliferation, and therefore this can be called as a proliferative phase. Now please remember the changes that are occurring in the uterine lining, and that is why it is called as a proliferative phase. Simultaneously in the ovary, the primary follicle must be developed, and it must develop into a Graafian follicle. If you remember the name, the mature follicle is called as the Graafian follicle, and therefore this stage, this is where the most of the follicle development will be taking place. And with respect to something which is happening in the ovary, we can call this phase as the follicular phase as well. So please remember, I am talking about the pre-ovulatory events of the menstrual cycle, and I am saying that the first phase would be the menstrual phase, which is followed by, if I talk about the changes occurring in the uterus, it would be called as a proliferative phase. And if I am talking about the changes that are occurring in the ovary, that would be called as the follicular phase. I will advise you to watch the previous video where I have clearly told you that what is a primary follicle, what is a secondary follicle, what is a tertiary follicle, what is a Graafian follicle. We have done it exhaustively, and I have made some good diagrams so that you are able to understand what is happening here. So without going into the details, so this primary follicle will ultimately mature into what is called as the Graafian follicle. Now what I would do is that I will look at the diagram that is given in your NCERT. So we will try to discuss the thing that has been mentioned in your NCERT. So thankfully it is not lost, and just pardon me for this. And this is the diagram that is given in your NCERT. Now this is the duration of one menstrual cycle. This is 28 days or 29 days. Look at what is happening to the uterine endometrium. This is where it is written uterine events. This is shed. This part would be called as the menstruation or the menstrual flow. As you can see, it can happen over 2 to 5 days. This is what is happening, and then it regenerates. Can you see the regeneration? So this is the regeneration. So first there is shedding of the uterine endometrium, and then this uterine endometrium is actually regenerated, and this regeneration is because of proliferation, and that is why we are calling it as a proliferative phase. And what is happening in the ovary simultaneously? There is a development of the follicle. So I have told you all these diagrams. So there would be a primary follicle, then a secondary, then tertiary, and then the mature Graafian follicle, and then this would be followed by the rupture of the mature Graafian follicle, leading to the release of the secondary oocyte, the event which is called as the ovulation. So can you correlate the ovarian events and the uterine events? The simple point that I was talking about. Now we know that this follicle has to develop inside the ovaries, and therefore there must be gonadotropins that must be secreted for the development of the follicle, and therefore you have what is called as the follicle stimulating hormone. So look at the pre-ovulatory part. You are looking at the follicle stimulating hormone, followed 1 or 2 days by the secretion of the luteinizing hormone. So these are the two hormones that are present in the pre-ovulatory part of the menstrual cycle, and we know that this FSH will lead to the development of the follicle, and it would be assisted by the LH. Incidentally, LH is called as luteinizing hormone, and it is called as luteinizing hormone because it converts normal cell into lutein cells, and lutein cells are highly secretory cells. That is why luteinizing hormone is called as luteinizing hormone, because it converts normal cell into new lutein cells, which are highly secretory in nature. So we know that this is what is happening here. And if you remember, I talked about the tertiary follicle, and that tertiary follicle, just let me recap this. I told you it is very, very important that you watch the previous video. It is very, very important. I am not going to repeat it because we are in the final revision part, and if you do not understand anything, I will strongly advise you to go and watch the previous video. We know that the oocyte, which is surrounded by, this is the secondary oocyte that has released the first polar body, which is surrounded by zona pellucida and is suspended in a mass of cells. These mass of cells, they are called as cumulus oophorus, and obviously there are some granulosa cells. I am making a very, very rough diagram. Again, I am telling you, if there is a problem, please watch the previous video. And then there is basal lamina, and then we say that there are some theca interna cells, and outside it there is a connective tissue capsule which is called as theca externa, and this is the space that is present in this vesicular follicle, and we called it as an antrum, and it is carrying a fluid, and this fluid is antral fluid, and the contribution to the antral fluid predominantly comes from the granulosa cells on which LH has acted upon. So LH that came just after the FSH now acts on the developing follicle cells, granulosa cells, and converts them into granulosa lutein cells. So you know a lutein cell will be secretory in nature, and that is secreting something into this antral fluid, and that's something you can see that around the day 6 or 7 there is a gradual beginning of the secretion of estrogen by the granulosa lutein cells, and immediately you can understand that this is estrogen that is getting high, and it reaches a peak just before ovulation. Look at the line that is drawn here. This is the line that shows the event of ovulation, and you can see that estrogen actually is secreted in the pre-ovulatory part by the developing follicle that are present in the cortex of the ovary, and this estrogen, you know, will be acting on the uterus and will be responsible for regenerating the endometrium by proliferation. So what is the function of estrogen? The function of estrogen in the pre-ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle is regeneration of endometrium through proliferation. I hope now these things are now absolutely clear. So again telling you that this is the follicle that starts developing first because of FSH and very soon with the help of LH. So both gonadotropins lead to the development of the follicle. The follicle develops predominantly in the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle into a mature Graafian follicle, and we know that LH is why LH is called as LH, and in the proliferative phase we will see that these follicles are actually secreting estrogen, and this estrogen is secreted by the granulosa lutein cell, and that estrogen helps in the regeneration of the shed endometrium through proliferation. I have told you this twice. I think now this should be absolutely clear. Now what happens is that you can see that the LH is reaching a peak, FSH is reaching a peak. Can you see the peak of the FSH? The red line would be FSH, the bluish line would be LH, and here again this would be estrogen, and all these three hormones, just watch carefully, I am explaining the diagram of your NCERT, they attain their peak just before ovulation. This is day 13, day 14. So if you are talking about an ideal menstrual cycle which would be of 28 days duration, so this is day 13, day 14, just few hours before ovulation there is a peak achieved. Now normally we know, so normally we understand that the hormonal axis works something like this. Hypothalamus releases a releasing hormone. This releasing hormone acts on anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary releases a tropin, and this tropin acts on the gland, and the gland produces its hormones, and there is a negative feedback control. So there is a negative feedback control, which means that if the hormones of these glands are increasing in amount, there would be corresponding decrease in the secretion of releasing hormone by hypothalamus and tropin by anterior pituitary. Now if you watch very carefully, very carefully, something strange is happening just before ovulation. Look at the level of the secretion of the estrogen. This estrogen is at its peak. Ideally, the LH and FSH should be at their lowest secretion, because estrogen should have a negative feedback control, negative control over the secretion of the releasing hormone and the gonadotropins. So we expect by this concept that whenever estrogen increases, the LH and FSH should come down, and when the estrogen is at a very high level, the LH and FSH should be at their lowermost level. But there is a unique phenomena occurring just before ovulation, that the estrogen undergoes a positive feedback. Now just see that both LH and FSH increase just before ovulation. It is not only LH that is increased in secretion, it is FSH as well. But the secretion increased in the case of LH is much more than the increase in the secretion of FSH. Can you see this? That this estrogen, it is at its peak, it undergoes a positive feedback. So this is unlike the negative feedback. It actually it leads to the increase in the secretion of gonadotropins, and the effect is more pronounced on LH, and the level of the LH especially dramatically increases. So mind you, FSH also increases, but not that dramatically as LH, and this thing is called as LH surge. So this would be LH surge. This would be a very important question. This is a rare example of positive feedback from human physiology. I hope this is absolutely clear, and this LH surge will lead to the rupture of the mature Graafian follicle. So suddenly the secretion increases inside the follicle, suddenly the number of the cells actually increase, and the pressure is increased, and it leads to the rupture of the mature Graafian follicle. And we know that from cumulus oophorus, can you see this is the cumulus oophorus, this is the secondary oocyte in the center, and this thing is released, and this thing is called as ovulation. So secondary oocyte arrested at metaphase 2 of meiosis 2 is released at the ovulation by the rupture of the Graafian follicle, and the precursor event responsible for this event would be the surge in the secretion of LH. Without LH surge, this thing is not going to rupture, and it will not lead to any release of secondary oocyte. That would be the importance of LH surge, and LH surge is because of a very rare positive feedback between LH and estrogen, and we know that even progesterone is actually increased. So there is no doubt, but now the effect is more pronounced on the secretion of LH. I hope this thing is absolutely clear. Now what happens is that, okay, so let us say this is the ovary, let us say the outer part is the cortex, and somewhere here let me say that this was the secondary oocyte that was present in the cumulus oophorus, and it ruptures and really leads to I am doing something wrong, so let me take this type of the eraser, and we say that the rupture will lead to the release of the secondary oocyte surrounded by a zona pellucida and certain cells, which we will see what are these cells in the next section. So this thing will be ovulation, and this is the release. Again and again I am telling you, it is actually secondary oocyte, and the ruptured Graafian follicle remains behind in the ovary. So where only the secondary oocyte surrounded by some cells has been released. The remaining part of the ruptured Graafian follicle is still present in the ovary. And please remember that just now the LH has actually surged. The secretion of the LH has surged, and that LH has acted upon the cells of this ruptured Graafian follicle and has converted this ruptured Graafian follicle into a body of lutein cells. And if you talk of biology, body means corpus. And that is why this ruptured Graafian follicle will be acting as a temporary endocrine gland and would be called as corpus luteum. I hope this thing is absolutely clear. So I hope this thing is absolutely clear. So the first of the functions of the menstrual cycle has been achieved. A single ovum has been released. This would be the norm that I am talking about. There can be more than one follicle that may develop. We are not going into the exception. We are talking about an ideal menstrual cycle and what normally happens. I hope this thing is absolutely clear. Then we are saying is that, okay, now we know that what exactly is a corpus luteum. So this is the word corpus luteum. It is a body. It is a corpus of what? Lutein cells. And what are these lutein cells? The cells that have been acted upon by the LH. And obviously FSH as well. So we are talking of granulosa cells, we are talking of the theca cells, and if you want to go into details and are not in the final phase of your preparation of the NEET entrance exam, I would advise you to go to my videos in the regular course where I have done an exhaustive discussion on the menstrual cycle. You can actually understand what is the role of FSH, what is the role of theca cell, what is the role of granulosa cell. But right now my focus, my target is the NEET entrance exam. So now I understand what exactly is corpus luteum. Now this corpus luteum now secretes large amount of progesterone, because now comes the second function that the menstrual cycle has to perform. And this second function is preparing the uterus for pregnancy. And we know that on the uterus will be acting the estrogen and progesterone. And this progesterone, we have not yet discussed it. And if you can see, the level of the secretion of the progesterone just begins at the time of the ovulation, just a few hours before ovulation, and then a large amount of progesterone. Can you see? A large amount of progesterone is secreted by the corpus luteum in the post-ovulatory phase. Yes, it also secretes some estrogen. So estrogen has two peaks. There is a pre-ovulatory peak of estrogen. There is a post-ovulatory peak of estrogen. As you can see that the pre-ovulatory peak of estrogen is higher than the post-ovulatory phase, and therefore estrogen, LH and FSH all attain their peak levels at day 13 and day 14, unlike progesterone, which attains a peak secretion in the post-ovulatory phase. Actually, it is predominantly secreted in the post-ovulatory phase by the corpus luteum, which is ruptured Graafian follicle, which is acting as a temporary endocrine gland. And this progesterone will be called as the pregnancy hormone. And please remember, the corpus luteum also secretes some amount of estrogen. We are not denying it. But if I have to answer one in my NEET entrance exam, that what is the important hormone that is secreted by corpus luteum, and if they are given in different choices, always the first answer would be progesterone, because now we are looking at the pregnancy function. Now look at the changes in the endometrium because of the increase in the secretion in the progesterone. Look, the progesterone is actually increasing in secretion, and can you see that the endometrium is getting more and more vascular and glandular, and hence more nutritive, and is getting ready for the implantation of the embryo in the case that the secondary oocyte which was released gets fertilized. And can you see the curve here? The progesterone is rising, and can you see what is happening to the uterine endometrium? And you can easily see that this is an increased vascularity. The glands become very, very coiled, very developed, and what happens is it becomes very secretory and very nutritive for the reception of the embryo in the event of fertilization. Now, a very important thing to understand, that is why we will be calling the post-ovulatory phase. We will be calling the post-ovulatory phase with respect to the ovary the luteal phase. So because what is present in the ovary? The corpus luteum, it is controlling the events here. So this would be called as luteal phase, and because I told you that the endometrium has become highly secretory with respect to the uterus, the luteal phase would also be called as the secretory phase. I think this thing is now absolutely clear. Now, when the ovum is released, let us say it is released on day 14 in our example. This is an ideal menstrual cycle of 28 days, and let us say that the ovulation occurs on day 14. Ovum, once released, must be fertilized within 24 hours of its release. So within 24 hours of the release, the ovum must be fertilized. If it is not so, then the ovum gets blighted. It does not develop, actually it regresses and it gets converted into a blighted ovum. Then it cannot be fertilized. That may explain some cases of infertility, because there is a narrow window for the fertilization. And the implantation, we will see later on, of blastocyst occurs on the wall of the uterine endometrium 7th 8th day post fertilization. So 7th 8th day post fertilization, the implantation would normally take place. So that means we are looking at day 15 the fertilization, and 8th day, let us say day 23. So this is the time 22nd day of the menstrual cycle, or the 23rd day or the 24th day of the menstrual cycle, where the implantation is likely to happen. And just see the beautiful physiology, that the endometrium is at its best and the secretion of the progesterone is at highest. And you do not want that a second pregnancy gets established during an ongoing pregnancy. So unless and until the fate of this released ovum is decided, the second follicle should not develop. And the follicle will develop because of the gonadotropins, and gonadotropins have a negative feedback type of suppressing effect because of the gonadal steroids. So that means if estrogen and progesterone are high, normally they should inhibit the secretion of gonadotropins. That would be the norm, because just before ovulation something abnormal occurred, not abnormal, something unusual occurred. That was a positive feedback. But look here, what is happening here? As you can see that the corpus luteum is secreting estrogen and progesterone, the level of the LH and the FSH does not increase, it actually remains low, because we do not want a second follicle to develop right away. We want to see what happens to the released ovum first, and then we will look at the development of the other follicles. So this is a very important thing happening. This progesterone actually leads to suppression of the LH and FSH along with the estrogen, and that prevents the development of another follicle before the fate of this follicle is decided. So again, coming back, this oocyte must be released within 24 hours, and the blastocyst must be implanted on day 7th or 8th. Now what has happened, that there has been no implantation. So let us say no fertilization occurs. So we are looking at the non-pregnant functions of the human female. So we say that there was an ovulation, but the fertilization did not occur. So there would be no blastocyst. Nothing is going to come and implant onto the wall of the endometrium. And what happens to the corpus luteum in this event is that it starts degenerating, because it requires LH, and LH is not present now in the post-ovulatory phase. And therefore what happens is that this corpus luteum starts degenerating, and this will lead to a decrease in the secretion of progesterone and estrogen. Can you see this? So there is a degeneration of the corpus luteum, and subsequently there is a decrease in the secretion of progesterone and estrogen. And mind you, the most important thing would be the decrease in the secretion of progesterone. Ultimately the corpus luteum degenerates into what is called as a corpus albicans, and it stops producing progesterone. And I know that it also secretes estrogen, but I am deliberately talking about progesterone because this is an important hormone in the post-ovulatory phase, and because this progesterone was maintaining this endometrium. So the highly nutritive state of the endometrium was because of the secretion of progesterone by corpus luteum. Now corpus luteum has degenerated, it is not secreting progesterone, and the support of the endometrium is withdrawn, and this leads to the sloughing of the endometrium. You can easily see that the withdrawal of the progesterone leads to the withdrawal of the support of the nutritive endometrium that gets sloughed, and this is the second menstrual cycle beginning. The first day of the next menstrual flow would be called as the first day of the next cycle, and when estrogen and progesterone come down, obviously the negative feedback effect on LH and FSH is gone, and again you can see the entire sequence of events will be repeated, and this would be one menstrual cycle. I hope now you understand what are the events of the menstrual cycle. Now this will continue till an age of approximately 50 years in most of the females, the age which is called as the menopause. And at the menopause, the menstrual cycle stops, the menstrual flow stops. So it is menarche to menopause, which would be called as the reproductive period in the life of a female. It is characterized by regularly occurring menstrual cycle. Day 1 of the menstrual cycle is called as the day 1 of the menstrual flow. The day 1 of the menstrual flow is called as the day 1 of the menstrual cycle. And from first day to the first day of the second cycle, all the events would be called as the events constituting a single menstrual cycle. They will occur periodically, and this will happen from menarche to menopause. But if there is lack of menstrual flow, now we know that something may happen otherwise if this oocyte gets fertilized. If this oocyte gets fertilized, the blastocyst will implant on the uterine endometrium, and the corpus luteum will not be allowed to degenerate and will continue to secrete large amount of progesterone, which will maintain the healthy endometrium, and there will be no menstrual flow. So in the reproductive age group, if a female misses the dates or the period or the menstrual flow, it is the first clinical sign of pregnancy. This is the first clinical sign of pregnancy, because she will miss the periods. The reason is that the endometrium does not get degenerated and continue to secrete progesterone. We will later on see in another video why is it so. And therefore, in a healthy female, the lack of menstrual during the reproductive age may be an indicator of pregnancy. Now remember this, that the lack of the menstrual flow may be because of the various reasons that include from, say for example, malnutrition to various stress factors to these lifestyle problems, etc. So all these may be responsible for the irregularity of the menstrual flow, menstrual cycle. But normally we would say that in the reproductive period, lack of menstrual flow may be indicator of an pregnancy. And during pregnancy, all events of menstrual cycle are suspended and the menstrual flow does not take place, because menstrual flow is shedding of the endometrium. During pregnancy, the endometrium is supporting the fetus. You can easily understand it should not be shed, and therefore there is no menstrual flow during pregnancy. I hope now you have understood the major events of your NCERT textbook related to this topic, which is 3.4, the menstrual cycle. When we come back, we will continue with the section 3.5.